When you look at another human being, particularly someone you care about, it's tempting to fix them in your mind as a static image. You take a snapshot of who they are in a single moment, their flaws, their missteps, their weaknesses, and you start to believe that's the sum total of their identity. But people are not photographs, they are stories, and stories are always unfolding. To reduce someone you love to the lowest point you've seen them reach is to deny the truth of human nature, that we are constantly in the process of becoming. Now, this is crucial to understand because it's easy, especially in moments of frustration, to assume permanence. She snaps at you, she shuts down, she fails to meet your expectation, and immediately you conclude, that's who she is. That's her character. But you're mistaking the snapshot for the entire film. A person in conflict is not the whole person. A person under stress is not their final form. To forget this is to miss the possibility of redemption and transformation. And this isn't just about her. This is about you as well. Because if you don't recognize the dynamic, ever-changing nature of another person, you'll also fail to recognize it in yourself. You're not who you were 5 years ago. Thank God for that. You've stumbled, you've struggled, you've grown. You've become someone capable of more clarity and strength than the earlier version of you. So, why would you deny her the same possibility? To demand perfection in her while granting yourself the privilege of becoming is hypocrisy, disguised as judgment. But here's the hard truth. Becoming isn't pretty. It isn't clean or polished. It's messy. Growth looks like failure. Transformation looks like falling apart before it looks like rebuilding. Think about the chrysalis. The caterpillar literally dissolves before it becomes a butterfly. It's chaos before order. And in human relationships, that chaos often manifests as conflict, as distance, as mistakes repeated again and again until the lesson finally takes root. The question is, do you have the patience, the strength, and the courage to endure the chaos long enough to witness the transformation? Or do you give up too soon, mistaking the storm for the end, when in fact it may be the necessary prelude to something greater? Now, none of this is to say you should tolerate endless dysfunction. There's a difference between enduring growth and enabling destruction. If she has no desire to change, if she refuses responsibility entirely, then you have to confront that reality with brutal honesty. But more often than not, people do want to change. They're just clumsy about it. They regress before they progress. They lash out when they're scared. They withdraw when they feel ashamed. And if you give up on her in that stage, you might be abandoning her at the exact moment she's fighting her hardest battle. There's another layer to this. Relationships themselves are crucibles of transformation. They are not merely about companionship or comfort. They are about refinement. Two people together press against each other's rough edges, sometimes painfully, in order to become stronger, wiser, more whole. You don't get a meaningful relationship without friction because friction is what polishes the stone. So when you're tempted to say, this is just who she is and I can't deal with it, consider whether what you're actually seeing is the process of her becoming someone greater, and whether your role is to stand firm while she wrestles with her imperfections, just as she, at other times, will be called to stand firm while you wrestle with yours. And here's something to consider deeply. The version of her you want most, the one who is resilient, tender, grounded, and capable of standing by you in strength, will not appear out of nowhere. She emerges precisely through the fire of these struggles. And if you flee the fire too quickly, you may never see that version of her at all. You may end up wandering through life, leaving behind half-finished stories, never realizing that greatness in a person and in a relationship only reveals itself after the crucible has done its work. This is the tragic pattern so many repeat, abandoning too soon, only to face the same challenges again with someone new.
Why?
Because they didn't recognize that the storm wasn't a sign to run, but a test of whether they could withstand the chaos long enough to reach the order on the other side. Relationships are not for the faint of heart. They demand patience, discipline, and vision. They demand that you hold on to the bigger picture when the immediate scene looks ugly. And if you can do that, not only does she have the chance to become more than she is today, but you also become the kind of man who can endure, who can lead, who can love with strength instead of with fragility. So before you give up on her, remember this. You are not dealing with a finished product. You are walking beside someone who is in motion, in flux, in process. Don't mistake a momentary failure for a permanent identity. Don't confuse chaos with finality. She is not merely who she is right now. She is also who she is striving, painfully and imperfectly, to become. And maybe, just maybe, the strength of your commitment is the very thing that helps her cross that threshold. So pause before you turn away. Ask yourself if what you see is the end of the story, or simply a difficult chapter in the middle of it. Because sometimes the greatest mistake a man can make is giving up on someone right before they become who they were meant to be. One of the greatest mistakes people make in relationships is assuming that what they see on the surface is the full truth. We look at her silence, her withdrawal, her sudden anger, or her tendency to retreat, and we interpret it as rejection or indifference. But rarely do we pause to ask ourselves the deeper question, what weight is she carrying that I cannot see? Because every human being, every single one, is burdened with invisible battles. Now, think about your own life. How many times have you acted out in ways that didn't reflect who you truly were? You snapped at someone not because you hated them, but because you were tired, overwhelmed, or ashamed of something you couldn't put into words. You shut down in a conversation not because you didn't care, but because the weight of your own thoughts was crushing you. If you can acknowledge that in yourself, then you must acknowledge that in her. Her reactions, her behaviors, are not always direct reflections of how she feels about you. They are often the echo of past wounds, of fears carried from long before you even entered the picture. And this is psychologically profound. When we experience deep pain, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, it leaves an imprint on us. Neuroscience shows us that trauma literally rewires the brain. It creates patterns of hypervigilance, defensiveness, withdrawal. So when she pulls away, it may not be you she's running from, but the ghost of something much older. When she raises her voice, it may not be you she's angry at, but the echo of someone else who hurt her long ago. What looks like a wall built against you is often a wall built for survival, one that was erected years before you arrived. And this is where compassion becomes essential. Compassion doesn't mean excusing destructive behavior or pretending pain isn't real. Compassion means understanding that her reactions might not be personal, even when they feel deeply personal. It means asking, what else might this mean? What burden is she carrying that I cannot see, but can choose to acknowledge? And that question, that pause, can change everything. Because the moment you stop taking everything at face value, you open the door to empathy. You stop reacting defensively and begin responding wisely. Of course, this isn't easy. Your pride will resist. Pride always wants to interpret her silence as disrespect, her distance as disinterest, her volatility as ingratitude. Pride says, if she really cared, she wouldn't act like this. But humility asks a deeper question. If she's acting like this, what pain might she be hiding? What story might she be reliving? And it's humility, not pride, that allows relationships to endure. Because pride demands validation, while humility seeks understanding. But let me be clear, understanding does not mean tolerating endlessly. If she refuses to confront her wounds, if she continually chooses denial or destruction, you cannot save her against her will. Compassion does not equal codependency. Yet, more often than not, what people truly need is not someone to fix them, but someone to see them, to recognize that their behavior is not who they are, but a symptom of what they've endured. When you can offer that recognition, you create the conditions for healing. You give her the courage to face her own shadows because she no longer has to do it alone. And here's a paradox worth considering. Sometimes the very thing you interpret as rejection is actually a desperate attempt at protection. She withdraws not because she doesn't love you, but because she fears being hurt again. She grows quiet not because she's given up, but because she's afraid of saying something that will push you away. She hides her emotions not because she lacks them, but because they overwhelm her so deeply that silence feels safer. If you misinterpret those signals, you may respond with anger or detachment, and in doing so, you confirm her fears. The cycle repeats. The tragedy deepens. So before you give up on her, stop and ask yourself, Am I truly seeing her or only my own interpretation of her? Am I reacting to her reality or to my projection of her reality? These questions matter because perception is not neutral. The story you tell yourself about her behavior will shape the way you treat her. If the story is false, the relationship collapses under a lie. But if you can hold the tension, if you can accept that what you see is not all that there is, then you leave space for the truth to emerge. And in that space, something remarkable happens. You begin to cultivate patience. You begin to cultivate resilience. You learn to hold back your impulse to retaliate, to shut down, to walk away, and instead you lean in with curiosity. You ask, you listen, you try to understand. And sometimes, that single act of listening, of being willing to acknowledge the invisible burden she carries, becomes the very thing that allows her to finally set them down. So here is the challenge. Do not give up on her simply because you cannot see the full weight she carries. Do not assume that her silence means she doesn't care, or that her anger means she doesn't love. Remember your own unseen battles and recognize that she has hers too. The measure of strength in a man is not how quickly he walks away when things become confusing, but how deeply he can see when things become unclear. And if you can do that, if you can see past the surface into the shadows, then you not only honor her humanity, but you elevate your own. Because the man who learns to see what is unseen becomes a man of depth, of patience, of true strength. And that is the kind of man who does not give up too quickly, but who stays long enough to witness the beauty that lies beneath the weight. It's an uncomfortable truth, but one that you must confront. It is far easier to focus on her flaws than it is to face your own. That's the great temptation in every relationship. You see her shortcomings clearly because they disrupt your comfort, they irritate your pride, they trigger your insecurities. And so, you make her faults the story. But the reality is, relationships function as mirrors. They reflect back not just who the other person is, but who you are. And very often, the behaviors in her that frustrate you most are the very ones that expose something you need to wrestle with yourself. Think about it. If she's withdrawn, maybe what you're actually confronting is your inability to handle silence without interpreting it as rejection. If she's emotional, maybe what unsettles you is your lack of capacity to sit with intensity without becoming defensive. If she's inconsistent, maybe what is being revealed is your own desperate need for control. In this sense, her flaws don't just point to her growth areas, they illuminate yours. And that's what makes relationships both so painful and so profoundly transformative. This is why running from conflict is such a tragic mistake. Because every time you walk away without examining your own role, you rob yourself of the chance to grow into the man you could be. You remain blind to the weaknesses she exposes in you, and you carry those same weaknesses into the next relationship, and the next, and the next. That's why patterns repeat. People leave one partner, thinking they've escaped the problem, only to find the same dynamics emerging again with someone else. Because the issue was never just her. It was you. It was what you refused to face in yourself. Now, this doesn't mean you are the sole cause of every difficulty. That would be absurd. But it does mean you are always a participant in the dynamic, and therefore you always bear responsibility for your contribution. Responsibility, that's the key word. It's the cornerstone of psychological growth and of meaningful relationships. The moment you stop blaming her and start asking, what is my part in this? That is the moment you move from childishness into maturity. That's the moment you stop being a victim of circumstance and start becoming a man capable of leadership and strength. But here's the catch. Taking responsibility requires humility, and humility is uncomfortable. It means admitting that your anger isn't always righteous, that your silence isn't always noble, that your withdrawal isn't always justified. It means asking yourself questions you don't necessarily want to answer. Have I really listened, or have I just waited for my turn to speak? Have I been patient, or have I been quietly resentful? Have I been honest, or have I withheld the truth out of fear of conflict? These questions sting, but they're necessary. Because if you cannot face your own shadow, you will project it onto her, and you will condemn her for carrying what is actually yours. This is the danger of projection. You take the things you don't want to acknowledge in yourself, and you pin them on her. You call her controlling when in fact you are terrified of losing control. You call her cold when in fact you are emotionally distant. You call her selfish when in fact you are unwilling to sacrifice. And then you convince yourself that leaving is justified, when the truth is, you are running from yourself, not from her. Now, imagine what happens if you flip this. Imagine that instead of blaming, you take each point of conflict as a signal to look inward. She challenges you. You ask, what is being revealed in me? She frustrates you. You ask, what weakness of mine is being exposed? She withdraws. You ask, what insecurity in me is being triggered? Suddenly, the relationship becomes more than just a place of companionship. It becomes a furnace of growth. It becomes a place where both of you are refined. And here's the paradox. When you take responsibility for your role, you actually create the conditions that make it easier for her to take responsibility for hers. Because responsibility is contagious. When you stop blaming and start owning your part, you set a standard. You model courage. You show her that accountability is possible, that change is possible, that growth is not a shameful admission of failure, but a noble pursuit of truth. And very often, that shift in you is the spark that shifts the entire dynamic of the relationship. But if you refuse to do this, if you persist in the illusion that the problem is always her, then you will not only fail her, you will fail yourself. You will become the kind of man who is perpetually disappointed in others, perpetually frustrated, perpetually restless. And you'll carry that dissatisfaction through life, never realizing that the real battle you needed to fight was the one within your own soul. So, before you give up on her, examine yourself. Ask whether your frustration with her is, in fact, a reflection of the discipline you have yet to cultivate in your own character. Ask whether the weakness you despise in her is the same weakness you've been unwilling to face in yourself. And remember, growth in a relationship is not just about her becoming who she could be. It's about you becoming who you must be. Because in the end, the man who refuses responsibility is not strong, he is weak. The man who blames endlessly is not wise, he is blind. But the man who confronts his own role, who wrestles with his own shadow, who takes ownership of his own flaws, that is the man who becomes capable of leading, of loving, and of enduring. So take a hard look in the mirror before you point the finger. Because sometimes the person you're most tempted to give up on isn't her at all. It's the unrefined, untested version of yourself. There's something you need to understand about walking away too soon. The cost is far greater than you think. At first, it feels like freedom. You convince yourself you've escaped conflict, frustration, and disappointment. You breathe a sigh of relief because the burden of trying has been lifted. But what you don't realize is that in leaving prematurely, you may not just be giving up on her. You may be giving up on your own capacity for endurance, loyalty, and strength. And that cost is invisible in the moment, but it accumulates over time, shaping the kind of man you become. We live in a culture that idolizes convenience. If something is difficult, the common advice is to discard it and replace it. That logic might work for broken objects, but it's disastrous when applied to human beings. Because people are not disposable, and neither are relationships. Every time you walk away at the first sign of hardship, you weaken your ability to persist. You train yourself in fragility. You reinforce the idea that struggle is a sign to quit rather than an opportunity to grow. And over time, that mindset infects every domain of your life, not just relationships, but work, purpose, and even your own inner development. Now, this doesn't mean you should stay in something destructive. I've said it before and it bears repeating. If there is no willingness to grow, no accountability, no desire for change, then staying is not noble, it's naive. But too often, we confuse the ordinary struggles of growth with irredeemable dysfunction. We see friction, conflict, misunderstanding, and assume it's a sign of failure, when in fact it's often the necessary tension that shapes people into better versions of themselves. If you run from that too quickly, you rob yourself of the very virtues that struggle exists to cultivate. Think of loyalty. Loyalty isn't tested when things are easy. It's proven in the moments when leaving would be simpler, when giving up would cost you less in the short term. But loyalty is not about short-term comfort. It's about long-term meaning. And meaning is always costly. If you want a relationship that endures, You cannot treat difficulty as an exit sign. You have to treat it as the forge where character is built, both hers and yours. The same goes for patience. Patience isn't required when everything is smooth. It's demanded when progress is painfully slow, when change happens at a pace that frustrates you, when you're tempted to demand results but are forced instead to wait. And patience, cultivated in love, spills over into every other aspect of life. A man who learns patience in his relationship becomes a man who can endure setbacks in his career, disappointments in his pursuits, and challenges in his responsibilities. But if you abandon patience here, you don't just lose her. You lose the discipline that could have made you resilient everywhere else. And then there's regret, perhaps the heaviest cost of all. Because regret is not loud in the moment. It whispers in the quiet years later. It whispers when you see her grow without you, when you realize she became the woman you longed for but lacked the courage to stand beside while she was becoming. It whispers when you notice the same conflicts repeating in every relationship you enter, because you never faced your own part in them. It whispers when you find yourself alone, not because love was impossible, but because endurance was too difficult. And that regret, the knowledge that you abandoned something that could have been extraordinary, is far heavier than the weight of struggle would have been. This is why perseverance matters so deeply. It's not just about saving the relationship. It's about saving yourself from becoming the kind of man who always takes the easy road, who always runs at the first sign of resistance, who never discovers what strength truly is. Struggle is not your enemy. Struggle is the crucible in which love, loyalty, and character are refined. If you give up on her too soon, you don't just lose her. You lose the chance to become the man capable of loving her fully. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine that you stay. Not blindly, not foolishly, but with clear eyes and a committed heart. Imagine that you face the difficulties head-on, that you confront your own flaws, that you recognize her unseen burdens, that you endure the chaos of transformation long enough to witness the emergence of order. Imagine looking back years later and realizing that the moments you were closest to walking away were the very moments that tested and proved your strength, and that out of that trial emerged something far greater than comfort, something meaningful, enduring, and true. That is what is at stake. The question is not just, do I give up on her? The real question is, who do I become if I do? Because every decision you make shapes not only your relationship, but your character. And the man you are becoming will echo through every corner of your life. So before you give up on her, pause and ask yourself, what am I truly walking away from? Is it merely her, or is it also the chance to cultivate loyalty, patience, strength, and meaning? Because if it's both, then the price is far higher than you realize. And perhaps the truth is this: the easy path of leaving will cost you far more than the difficult path of staying ever could.